This is a 1969 Atmos Gruen overhaul video. This clock was described as being recently serviced, in good running condition, keeping great time. I mean, it's right, everything. It was losing 7 minutes a day, and part of the reason is it's dirty. The clock balance is only rotating at about 300-degree amplitude. That explains why it's running 7 minutes a day slow. So you tell me, do you think this was a clock that has recently been serviced and is in good running condition, keeping good time? All right, everything is taken apart. The mainspring was a little sticky. Maybe that's part of why it wasn't running so well. It's also a little too big. The mainspring measured out at about 90 millimeters. I like to see them closer to 65 millimeters. The wood case is in pretty good condition. The bellow is in excellent condition, measured out at 28 millimeters at room temperature. The gold looks pretty good on the frame. A little bit of corrosion on the one on the left. You'll notice that the suspension spring has been removed from the balance tube. I do put new suspension springs in all my clocks unless my client doesn't want me to. But once that clock reaches at 40, 50 years old, it's going to get a new suspension spring. Here's all the little bits and pieces. And I think all I have left to do is to tear the movement apart. And here we go. These will all go through the part washer tomorrow or later on this week when I have time, and I will begin the reassembly process. Day 2 assembly. First thing we're going to do is make sure our fork is poised with this homemade device. This is a step that almost every clockmaker skips because they don't have the equipment, but a fork that is not properly poised will stop a clock dead in its tracks. We got a good poised fork. Let's go ahead and assemble the movement. As you are assembling the movement, be very careful. Do not break any pivots. They are very small. As you are installing all of your wheels and escapements, just very gently tighten everything down. Test before you tighten anything down. Make sure that the movement moves very freely. It should be effortless. Then you can go ahead and install your fork. Once the fork's installed, operate that bottom wheel. Make sure that the fork flutters properly to the left and flutters to the right when you reverse direction of the wheel. Once you're done with the movement, you can set it aside. Next, we're going to work on taking off the old suspension spring. We're going to remove the suspension spring from the top top regulator clamp. Remove the suspension spring from the bottom regulator clamp with a razor blade. And throw that old spring away. We're going to install the new spring in the upper regulator clamp first. This is a very tedious process. This kills most clockmakers. This is what guys avoid doing. I know guys who've gone through 6 springs trying to get this in, so it takes me about 5 minutes. Very simple. Now I am going to install the spring in the bottom regulator clamp. Everything's installed. I'm going to gently drop it through the balance tube, not to twist the spring, but I'm twisting the tube when I tighten it onto that bottom screw. Okay, now I'm going to slide that upper regulator clamp all the way to where it should be, and notice I have a lot of suspension spring left over on the top. Right now I'm weighing the weights, making sure I have the exact amount on both sides. I'm going to install the tube on the balance. Now that tube is going to have to be poised at some point because anytime you take those two components apart, they have to be poised. But before we do that, this is a very delicate process. I have kinked a couple springs, fishing the suspension spring through the regulator, so be very careful. Okay, I'm going to take the weight off of that balance and put my tug on the suspension spring from the top, put the pin in, and use a hammer to gently tap that pin in place. Take it off that ceramic cup, and now I'm going to tap it in just a little bit more to make sure it's perfectly centered between that stop plate. I'm going to tighten the screw on that peg, and we're good to go. But one last step, we have to make sure this balance tube is poised, so that's what I'm doing now. It's a very slow process. It takes a long time. Sometimes it takes me an hour to get everything perfect. This one went pretty fast. The tube is perfectly poised. And now I'm just making sure that the duckbill on the upper regulator clamp is rotated in the exact position I want it in. I'm going to, it looks like I'm making some final adjustments here with the poising the tube. I'm going to let that sit aside now till tomorrow, because once that wheel stops rotating and it's steady, that balance, I can go ahead and put the balance in beat. I'm cleaning off the main suspension spring with some 1-dip. I'm lubricating it with some Mobius 9020, just some very thin coats of Mobius. Not heavy, not thin, or not too thin, just the right amount where you can get good lubrication, but nothing that's going to be sticky. You don't want this to get sticky in another 5 or 10 years. This oil should last a very long time. It's a synthetic oil. And I'm just lubricating the arbor, putting everything back together, and we're good to go until tomorrow. Day 3, the balance has been resting overnight. It's remained completely still. I have put the balance in beat, meaning that the impulse roller is at the center of the frame. Here we are going to look at the stop collar. There's a top and a bottom stop collar over the stop plate. Your clearances here are only about 0.3 millimeters from the top to the bottom. So when we were setting the suspension spring pin and I was pulling up on the suspension spring and driving the pin in, I was setting that height. This is the pin I set. So I pulled up on the spring, put the pin in, give it a gentle tap, then I tapped it down a little bit more and set the screw. Now you think that the balance isn't moving. This is a 30-minute time lapse of the balance at rest, 24 hours after everything was assembled. It's always moving. That just goes to show how much the suspension spring contains energy and releases it. So this kind of makes it a little bit difficult to make sure everything's in beat because it's always moving. 30 minutes to make this rotation. All right, it's time to start to put everything back together. Going to start by putting the barrel in, the intermediate wheel, and the frame. These are the only pivots that are going to be lubricated with Mobius 9020, is those two arbors on the barrel, and of course the intermediate wheel will get lubricated as well. Everything else must remain dry. This is a good time to get everything nice and tight. Those 6 screws on the frame should be snug. Okay, now I'm just making sure that the chain is perfectly aligned. We don't want any links that are crooked as it's coming into the pulley. I'm going to set the rear spring and the little pin. I'm going to measure this distance. We want to see, I think it's between 45 and 48 millimeters. I'm a bit short, or too long. I'm going to have to bring this in. I like to shoot for 47.5 millimeters if possible, and that's exactly what I achieved right there. We're perfect. I'm going to give it a couple pumps, and I'm checking the rotation of the arbor on the barrel. It's got a little red dot on it. You can't see it. But we want to see between 5 and 8 rotations of that barrel, meaning if we do, we have a good spring. Turns out this spring had 5 1/4 rotation, so I'm going to keep it. It's a good spring. So I put a rubber band around the balance. I'm stopping it. I'm letting it relax, and I'm fitting the balance onto it just to see how the fork lines up. This fork, I can't believe it. It lined up perfect the first time. I did not have to do any adjusting. Usually I'll have to adjust that fork for, 15 minutes, half hour, an hour, whatever it takes to get it perfect. I'm going to set everything in motion now, and this is a good time to start keeping track of what your amplitude is. So everything's put back together. Amplitude is going to tell you the condition of how accurately this clock is going to be able to maintain time. So I'm going to document on the side of the paper that's installed on this table what time I started. And I think this was, it was March 15th at 10:15 a.m. And I'm just making some small adjustments, making sure everything's perfectly plumb and level. I'm gonna let this run. I'm gonna check on it for 2 hours. In 2 hours, I'm gonna take a reading on the amplitude and document it. Then I'll check it in another 2 hours. Hopefully we see that amplitude start to kind of gain a little bit every 2 hours, gain a few degrees. It should level off. Let it run maybe till late this afternoon, and I'll put the dial and the hands on and start regulating. Okay, the clock has been running for about 6 hours, and we are going to measure amplitude. These motifs are 30 degrees apart. We're going to look at this first motif. It's going to stop right there at that bubble. That one little bar is going to be 0. So this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This thing is moving. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, I think we can call this about 19 and a half. Comes out to 585 degree amplitude. It's quite a bit, especially considering I have 4 weights on the balance. That's because we put in a thicker suspension spring, so I had to add weights. That'll try to get my time back to within 3 minutes when I start regulating this in the next couple of days. And as we rotate back in the other direction, we're going to count the same thing, just over 19, close to 19 and a half motifs are rotating by. So it's looking good. This clock might just be a keeper for me. Installing the hands and a dial is pretty straightforward. When you install the hands, never move the hour hand forward. Only the minute hand can be moved forward. Okay, the clock was up and running for a day. I take 3 amplitude readings a few hours apart from each other, and it was running at 550 degree amplitude, 8 minutes a day fast. So what I did was I added 0.8 grams of weights to each side of the balance. Those are those little washers. And amplitude has picked up to 566 degrees, and I am now running 28 seconds a day slow. So this is perfect. Now I can begin regulation using the regulator lever. Did put a new coat of lacquer on the base of the clock, and also I'm going to touch up these windows. As you can see, there are some areas of these windows that have a little bit of corrosion. I want to coat these in lacquer and stop any further progression. The clock is finished. I think it turned out really well. We have a clock that started out 7 minutes a day slow, 300 degree amplitude. It's keeping perfect time now. I'm within just a couple, I think I'm within 1.5 seconds a day. The amplitude is very high at around 500 degrees is where I've leveled off. If you're interested in having your clock overhauled, just send me an email.